all saw that image. We all saw that image of the astronaut on the horse on the moon. November, ChatGPT comes out, fastest adopted app in history, 100 million in 2 months. And June, we're already having a webinar about the impact of generative AI on all of us. And there's a writer's strike going on in Hollywood. So just imagine how much everybody is reacting to this technology. And the more research you do, the more you'll realize the reaction is justified. It is amazing how much friction these large language models have taken out of the way we interact with machines, the way we interact with software, the way software interacts with data, and the way we interact with data. All that friction is suddenly unlocked. And in fact, it's gone from friction to an advantage, because now generative AI can summarize very large amounts of data for you, so you can actually make a better informed decision than you could before. So opportunities are absolutely endless. And however, it's a new technology. It has a lot of considerations, a lot of things to think about. So just amazing things to discuss. So Lauren, this is why we're here. A lot of questions coming to us from our customers, a lot of partnership opportunities for everybody. And that's what we want to address. So Justin, I would love to hear what you think.
Yeah, thanks. My background is largely in kind of the customer experience sphere, which if you go read any recent research, you're going to say, hey, that's where a lot of the disruption or a lot of the value is believed it's going to come from. And so the marketing and sales and service kind of use cases. And so I felt like that was probably the case when I first started hearing more about generative AI. Analytics and machine learning have always been important in those kind of functions. So I've always kind of leaned that way anyways. And then I started to play with it. And when I started to play with it, that's really where my perception of it accelerated. And I'm using it in my day-to-day, and I see my teams using it, and I've been advocating for how my clients can use it. So it's been transformational, really. And I kind of counter that to, what was in the hype cycle the last 2 years around metaverse. Metaverse was fun. I had an Oculus. I've got kiddos who enjoyed watching me look like a fool with a headset on. And obviously this may come back around with Apple's headset, though it's got some, design advantages to what we had previously. But when I thought of the metaverse and the use cases and how it can impact business and drive business value, there's definitely a lot there, but it didn't permeate as many industries and as many people as obviously we'll talk more about it in the session, but it's been fascinating to just already see how it's driving real business value.
I'm just like thinking about some of the things you mentioned. The transformation impact of generative AI has feels so sudden, but in reality, like you said, it's been in the works for almost 80 years. I think 80 years ago, they had the first neural network, and they thought they had already figured that out. And what changed is the natural language processing allows machine learning to just consume the internet effectively as training data. So video, audio, text, textbooks, journals, papers, whatever, it can just now consume it. And that was the inflection point that suddenly made this feel like it was an explosion. So best example that I have seen in my life of slowly at first and then all of a sudden, right? Like it just instantly showed up, and it was because of this natural language processing and the power. In fact, like you said, economic impact, I think McKinsey is putting generative AI economic impact at between 2.1 trillion and 4.4 trillion, on top of about 11 to 14 trillion that was already expected from AI and ML before. So the impact is very hard to process. But let me just start with framing generative AI in context of the other things, and then we'll address some questions that we've gotten from all you guys. Thank you, everybody, for sharing questions. So the thing that helped me most was understanding that generative AI sits on top of these foundational models. So we've heard of them, GPT-3 from OpenAI, or Palm or Palm 2 from Google, or Llama from Meta. These are the foundational models. And right now, they are very generalized. They are truly looking at the whole internet, and they don't have guardrails yet. That's why they are making stuff up or hallucinating. But what is going to change is the ability of having these foundational models be domain specific or topic specific. So you can train it just on your documents, your content, or on medicine or pharma research or financial scores, whatever your specific need is. You train a foundational model to that need, and then the generative AI, which is the language processing model, sits on top of that. And those two in combination is when you start unlocking true business values. So that's what the next wave is. If you read about the Databricks acquisition of Mosaic, that's because they're going to bring foundational models to everybody as a product and a feature, which is going to drive us. It's going to supercharge the world, I think. So the fact is, generative AI is what unlocked access to these foundational models for all of us, because we can speak to it in normal English and it can speak back to us in normal language, not just English, all the other languages. And then the other research that's going on right now is responsible AI, which is figuring out how to add guardrails to the foundational models and make sure that we don't ignore all the realities we have in our lives of data privacy and IP protection and copyright and racial bias and things like that. So responsible AI is trying to figure that out for regulated industries and for all these other areas where these things matter. And the other things, concepts of like supervised learning, unsupervised learning, those are all just how the models get generated. So it's almost like, think of everything else as the base, foundational AI, how they get created, all the models, and then generative AI sits on top of that and uses the intelligence from the foundational models to produce the content that we want. Right now it fills in the gaps. Right now it wants to make us happy, and it is allowed to fabricate. And that's why, while it's amazing for entertainment, where accuracy doesn't matter, it's not yet perfect for business because it's not accurate. So while I love the biblical verse of how to take out a PB&J sandwich from your VCR, that's mind-blowing and I love it. I cannot yet let it answer customer support questions from Telium because it will still make stuff up when it doesn't know something. So, like, that's kind of where we're sitting right now. It's magical, but there's got, things coming that we are waiting for to make it truly available to business in all ways. So I don't know, Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And when you and I were meeting previously, one of the analogies I use is if we were starting a brand new call center or a customer service center, we wouldn't go ask the brand new hire to answer calls and be the face of the company on day one, right? And that's a little bit of where we're at with generative AI. It's extremely valuable. It's going to be important to the future success of a lot of our functions. And we've got to work with it and train it and make it better and figure out how to use it better. And honestly, that's one of the things I mean, folks will look me up at some point, maybe after this call. Like, I recently joined KPMG. One of the reasons I joined KPMG is I felt like all the things you just mentioned are critical for customer experience professionals going forward in the terms of, like, when you look at artificial intelligence and how to use it, the things that are going to matter the most, the number one thing, KPMG did a study, the number one thing executives are worried about when it comes to generative AI is risk. How are we going to control it and govern it and keep bias out of it? And we don't have all the answers today. We have ways that we think we can do that, but the silver bullet doesn't exist today. And that's the sort of thing, as a person in the consulting side of this equation of folks on the call, like, that's where we're spending a lot of time with clients is the governance and controls and with a lens towards customer experience and customer strategy, because that's the piece we got to figure out now.
Yeah, I love that. And yesterday, I think, Justin, when we were chatting, you were talking about an analogy about farming. And that's it's a great analogy to set up. Can you share that? Because it sets up the potential of AI.
Yeah. I think somebody will go fact check me. Eventually, generative AI will fact check me. So don't hold me to the exact percentages. But the analogy is 100 years ago, or now maybe 110 years ago, 2% of the U.S. population did something other than farming. something other than, contributing to the food sources of America. And now it's the opposite. Now less than 2% of the US population is actually doing something that contributes to the food sources of America. And that's what's going to happen. I think it happens with any innovation, but over 100 years. But I think generative AI is one of those things that will, I believe, fundamentally change a lot of the job roles that we have today. And you already see that from some of the research and things that Microsoft and others are putting out, and that there's already a focus on how do I write better prompts so that I can get more out of generative AI versus how do I code this widget, right? Like eventually you won't need to know how to code the widget because the computers are smart enough to create the code. That already exists for a lot of things, right? So we're already seeing, the job title may stay the same, but the reality of what that person does every day is a little bit different. You mentioned you mentioned the writer's strike, right? Like a lot of the initial videos I saw around generative AI were in journalism, and hey, is now the journalist dead and the robots are going to create the articles? And there's a really good video of the gentleman talking about, it's the creativity is still there, but now the creativity is in writing the prompts and building from the prompts. And I'll use one more analogy. There's a study out there, and a professor does this thing with his class, and he says, hey, what are all the ways you can use a toothpick? People come up with a bunch of ideas. They then come back and they're like, okay, they share the ideas. Like, okay, what are more ways? They go come up with more ways. And this happens over, call it an hour and a half process. Well, now you can get to that fourth iteration after generative AI gets you to the first three in a matter of minutes, right? If you go ask generative AI, hey, what are all the ways to use a toothpick? You get 50 answers, and then you say, hey, tell me 50 more answers. It'll give you 50 more answers. And now you kind of take that knowledge base and you go to the third layer with your time as a human and the human creativity that still is paramount and exists, and you're adding to those other two layers. So I think it's going to move pretty quickly. It already is moving quickly in consulting where we operate, and how we serve our clients. So I'm sure it's going to move quickly in other industries.
Yeah, that I love the analogies you have, Justin. I think I'm going to keep asking for them. You reminded me of this story. So when IBM Blue beat Gary Kasparov, and everybody was shocked that that was the first intelligence system that beat a world champion. And then of course they kept trying to beat the AI, and the AI kept getting better. But then they did another tournament maybe 5-6 years ago where an amateur player combined with an AI beat everybody, beat all the world champions and all the AIs. And they proved that actually AI plus human is better than either. And it's because AI can process and summarize so fast that it improves our decision-making ability. And that's what they're really hoping that this unlocks more than anything, is a true augmentation and almost explosion of our abilities, because we use it in a very targeted way at the right time, and it can suddenly supercharge what we're doing. So building on what you were saying, one of the things that we've already tried and we found is using generative AI for content concepting right at the beginning is really powerful, because it'll throw ideas at you, like you were just saying about the toothpick, so fast, and it's such a scale that you can very quickly find avenues that you might have been ignoring. And then you can actually go towards your production process. So of course, there was an example for anybody who's tracking the Cannes Awards. McCann Worldwide won an award for creating 42,000 unique posters for these small mom and pop hamburger and burger stands. And they were able to do that because of generative AI. They built all these inputs, and then the generative AI made these unique posters. Now this is where I think the power is going to come, right? Is where you apply the creativity and where you apply the raw horsepower of the generative AI. That's what people are going to get creative on, how they mix it, how they use it. And I think we'll start seeing really, really powerful things. So in that vein, Justin, do you have any examples that you really enjoyed, or things that you feel are good examples of what this can do?
Yeah, no, you used one of them already, so that was a good one. As a former CMO, I think a lot about the marketing and sales use cases. One point I want to amplify is human plus machine is what we believe the answer is, not machine only. All right. From a use case standpoint, we've used them. this is where it's always interesting with folks when you're talking about something new. I think a lot of people want to hear something they never heard before. And I don't think that's where the real value is. The real value is, how do we do things we've always aspired to do? We just do them better. And one of the examples, I see it in the question already about next best action. I've been talking about next best action with clients for 20 years. The concept of, we want to take a bunch of information in, and then as close as real time, we want to use that information to identify the next best action. Like, that's a concept that's existed before computers, right? Now with computers, we can do it better. Now with generative AI, we can do it better. And that's where I see a lot of potential. To your specific question, though, I had a team last week working on a proposal. And in consulting, a lot of times we, you start with a blank slide and then you got to create. And there's this period of writer block that exists of like, what do I put on the page? And it exists to some extent for everyone, no matter how much you've been in the industry. And the generative AI created the first slide. We at KPMG made a big bet, one of the first, if not the first, professional services firms, mostly because of how much we do in accounting and tax. But we have a OpenAI or Microsoft AI powered GPT engine now that all of our associates can use with confidential data, because it's in our private instance, and we're using it. And it created slide one in 20 seconds, and now we're iterating on that slide to make it what we really want it to be. But what took an hour now takes 20 seconds. And it's a better product at the end of the day than it was before. And so we're seeing that in our content creation. We're seeing that in our innovation and ideation, right? Like, again, the toothache example is a great example, because you could apply that to any client problem, and start getting even more creative, even though the initial hypothesis is that this will make us less creative because it's a machine doing it. But actually, again, you put the human with it, it'll make us more creative.
I totally agree. I feel example that I can think of is, I still remember all the phone numbers from all my high school friends, but I don't know any new phone numbers since I got my cell phone. And it's not that I can't contact anybody. I'm just using that part of my brain for other things now. And I feel like that's what's going to happen here, right? Like, we're still going to do the work we have to do. We just have much more access to insights from the data that we were trying to consume ourselves before. One AI that's already out there is like this video. Once we record this video and take it back, if you put it in that AI, it'll give you a blog post, a social post, a headline, a summary, key takeaways. And then you, of course, will modify them and make them what you want, but it jumpstarts it for you to a very big degree. So you go 0 to 60 in like 0.1 second, and then you can go to 100 on your own time. But I think that the power it unlocks is amazing. So I want to stay on, you mentioned personalization. I know we've got some questions about next best action and A/B testing. Can we talk about that for a little bit? Have you guys tried anything with this in personalization? I know that that's a very, very big area that people are getting excited about, because content has been such a roadblock in personalization all this time that now people feel like this is the magic that's coming.
Yeah, I think I think we got to answer that with artificial intelligence and generative AI. So one is, artificial intelligence and machine learning has been inside of marketing technology for years now, right? So that's not new, right? And that already exists. So that's a different, we can talk about like what that does and how that runs better testing. But again, that's not generative AI. Generative AI sits on top of that to now try to create new things, right? Like, it's more oriented around creating new based on the foundation of information versus what a lot of traditional artificial intelligence kind of machine learning use cases were. So when it comes to generative AI specifically in testing or personalization, I go back to the creativity side of it, and again, you can do this now with ChatGPT if you're comfortable, given it's open, or again, in the case of KPMG, we've made a decision with Microsoft to build something more, protected for our associates. But I go back to the writer's block kind of concept. Like, hey, I spend time in financial services. I want to sell more checking accounts. Hey, generative AI, here's my current messaging. How could I improve this messaging? How might this messaging change if I were talking to somebody that had this background or this type of buyer value? And again, what you get is only as good as the prompt that you write. And what really, I took a C++ class in college because I was an engineering guy originally. And so I tried to use generative AI the first time the way I would write computer code. And I wasn't that pleased with it. And I was talking to a buddy of mine and I just said, hey, like and his point, and the comment he made to me that stuck with me was like, talk to it like you would talk to a person and see what you get. And so I tried that, and all of a sudden, for me, in the tool that we use here at the company I'm at, I started to see much better responses out of it. I started to see much more applicability out of it because I was trying to make it too technical when I talked to it. Again, generative AI is not built that way. Generative AI is built to be more conversational. Take what you say, and then sitting on top of a bunch of data that, again, a lot of conversational type data, bring it back and to create something new. So. Very long-winded, but in the personalization case study, yeah, tell me 10 different ways to communicate this message. Now I have those messages, and now I can go spend the time to test them, and instead of spending the time to create the initial version of the messages, right? So it's a little bit nuanced, but that's where, again, to your point, that's the headspace is spent doing those things instead of the other things.
Yeah, it's so true. I think that's what I've been, as I talk to experts and as I understand the usage of this, that's the real power, is that now this AI can truly consume and generate code. It can generate video, it can generate audio, it can generate text. So, 80 or 90% of the world's data today is unstructured data. And that's primarily because of we are a TikTok generation, right? We're all video. And the fact that now AI can consume video, that is going to be the transformation for all of us, because think about how much video content we have just in our company, training content, sales calls, all these webinars, all these research that we have to do. We don't have time to actually consume it. But because the generative AI can consume it, it can become the expert on that topic, and then it can be our assistant. And, people are talking about the power that this will bring when, like you were saying, it will shift where you spend your time, but it also shift where you can truly accelerate your output, because this can show up with all the insights that you need. And then you add to it this conversational element, which is all interaction can be through a chat prompt. And you suddenly start realizing that you don't have to learn technology. Like on the consumer side, the use case is I can book an entire vacation, hotels, flights, theme parks, restaurants, movies, all within one UI, which is pretty crazy. And on business side, the exact same thing. Like I could go, HubSpot has that video on right now, where in one prompt, you can get reports, you can build audiences, you can activate, you can do quality checks, you can fix code. So I don't know if we truly understand the amazing frictionless experiences we can start having when you can interact through 10 different applications from one prompt, right? Like that. I do believe that will really unlock some things that we've never thought about before.
Yeah, and to your point, like I think you made this comment yesterday, and also it's kind of it's inside of what you're saying here. As it gets more integrated into the things we already use, then it's going to be much more transformative. And I remember the first time I used Microsoft Slide Designer, I like dropped in a pasted image, and on the right-hand side, it gave me 15 ways to make it look great. Again, that's something I would have had to have done with my time, and now I can do it with a click, and now I can spend my time doing something else. The other thing I did, I thought would be kind of funny, is I took some of the questions that were submitted before this session, and I asked ChatGPT. I asked the question to ChatGPT, and I got pretty good answers. Like, oh, that's a better answer than I would have given you, right? Like, and I just dropped the personalization one in there, and it says, I was looking over on my other screen. It's like, I said, how can generative AI make personalization better in marketing? And it says customized content generation, and it gives some things. It says dynamic ad creation, personalized messaging, chatbot interactions, product and service co-creation, testing and optimization. And it gave me the answers. Now I need to put my human brain on it and go see if I agree with them. But it created in 30 seconds what I would have talked to you about much longer, and it wouldn't have been as good. The other, I always try to apply this stuff to my own personal experiences. I have a bookshelf over here full of books that I buy because people say they're good books. And I used to say, I already mentioned earlier, I used to be in engineering, so I'm not a good reader. My 10-year-old daughter is better at that than me. I used to say, hey, I wish I could just download the book into my head. Like I could download, I want the knowledge. I'm just too lazy to go acquire it. Well, people like me are going to really love this capability because I can go now and say, hey, generative AI, tell me what the key points are for these 3 books, not just generically, but for these 3 books. And it's going to go create that. So if you own stock in Get Abstract or booksummaries.com type thing, like I would probably sell that stock because it's all free now for these tools. But I'm not giving investing advice, so please don't delete that part of the recording. But that's the work to go create that foundation of knowledge is going to get much less work's going to have to happen there. And now we're going to spend time on how do we take that knowledge and turn it into intelligence and actually use it and drive value with it.
Yeah, so you're hitting an awesome question that Samir has here, which is, as we use AI for code generation and we start utilizing it for, like you just said, research and learning, what happens to subject matter experts and technical people? And do we all just become generalists? And what happens to differentiation, right? Like it's such an interesting downside of this potential.
Yeah. I mean, I have to go back to comparing the jobs we have today versus the jobs that existed 100 years ago, right? They're fundamentally different jobs. And I think, I do a lot of mentoring in the consulting apprenticeship model, right? And I always hammer with my teams, like everything I help clients with today at KPMG didn't do as a company 5 years ago, right? And the industry probably didn't do 20 years ago. So I've had to invest for me, my biggest asset is my ability to learn and adapt, and then take those learnings and try to apply them to client business problems. And so if your worth is in because you can write the best code possible, then that's a job I would be really worried about. If your worth is, hey, I can figure out how to write code or how to create through technology ways to solve business problems, well, that's a skill that's going to be there. You're just going to do it a little bit different in the future than you do it today.
I love how you put all this stuff in context. It's great. So let's move on to some of the risks and some of the issues that people have to think about. I think some are obvious when you think about AI and ML, but there's a reason why generative AI hasn't just exploded in all businesses just yet, right? Even though it's so accessible and even though we can see how brilliant it is, we are waiting. And what are some reasons why people are waiting, and what do you think they have to do to get there?
Yeah, I think there's number one is risk. As I mentioned from the study that KPMG executed, over 75%, 77% exactly of executives said generative AI was going to be, the number one disruptor or number one impact to their business against other, kind of innovations that are out there. Less than 20% said the metaverse, right? 77% said generative AI, and there's a host of others that are kind of called out in that study. And the number one, I'll lump it together as kind of just risk and the conservative nature of business decisions. Like that's the number one thing people are trying to figure out. And it's across a host of different things that come together to form generative AI. It's, where does the foundational data come from, and does that data have bias, and do we have permission to actually use that data, right? So those are going to be jobs, by the way, in the future that are more important than we need more of them in the future than we needed today, right? Because that's going to be something people are going to have to do to make sure these models work in the future. Most technologies, this is called out in a few different places, but most technologies end up creating more jobs than they replace, because you need the jobs to help get the most out of the technology. So one is kind of, where does the data come from? Two is going to be, companies are going to have to own it. Well, I work in regulated industries. I've spent a bunch of time in healthcare, a bunch of time in financial services. So my set is a little bit different than probably the broader set. But in those two industries, there's information you just can't use in the day-to-day course of your business. Protected class information or personal health information, that sort of stuff. And so there's going to be jobs and processes where we're going to have to, in those industries, get that data out of there, or get the second order versions of that data out of there, right? Like that's a big issue in financial services today, is we've got models that maybe don't use that data, But once we add protected class data into it, we find that actually that is what's driving the model, because that type of data was driving certain type of the characteristics that we were using that then were driving the model that we use. So again, there's complexity. It's got to get solved. That's probably why it's a little bit slower. There's information sharing. How much of your client confidential information do you want to put into an OpenAI place, right? So you've got companies, all the big technology companies I've mentioned, Microsoft, but obviously there's others. They're starting to create versions of that where the company can own more of that environment. And then lastly, I love one of the questions we had was like, how do we know it works? Well, like anything, you're going to have to test it. And sometimes it will work and sometimes it won't work.
Yep.
The beauty of artificial intelligence more broadly, not just generative AI, is as you give it that feedback, it's going to learn, and it's going to eventually hit that curve where it's working, it's going to work more and more and more and more. So that's a word salad of stuff that's got to get figured out. And that's why the adoption isn't as fast as it could be, but it's still pretty fast, right? You've got the stats of how fast it is. So it's not moving slow. And the smaller companies are going to take more risks and go use it faster than the bigger companies. And as somebody who's at a bigger company, we've got to figure out how we can do both. How can we be innovative while staying true to our ethics and our the regulatory and risk requirements that we have?
Yeah, I love what you just said, right? I just said that this was the fastest adoption in history, and that within 6 months we're already talking about this. And then I asked, why is it not faster? Like, that just shows what we are expecting from this AI. The thing that a lot of the experts are talking about is that as we use AI to create more content, we have two issues. One is quality. Like, it's not necessary that more quantity is better quality also. And one is this fact that, is it human created or AI generated? And in fact, EU right now is trying to pass a law, I think they're voting on it today, that will require AI generated content to have a watermark that clearly discloses that it's AI generated, like we see sponsored content in all the publications already marked that way. So EU is trying to put that out there. Michael has the question about just what happens to truth and disinformation out there. That is the number one risk, period, with generative content right now. It is already, in fact, hallucinating and creating stuff that it says is real when it's clearly not real. And I just want to point out, it's in the name. It's called generative AI. It creates content. That's literally what it's supposed to do. So I think these are the guardrails. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it's I think it was Google. There's some studies recently about, and I think it's in the context of generative AI, but it might be more technology holistically, which is the open architecture, the open AI, the citizen developer, that concept, the things that are free are moving much faster than some of the things that technology companies can create. And it's because they have, you may have 10,000 engineers that you're trying to get the most out of that are tied down into bureaucracy. And then you've got, college kids everywhere just giving you free time at night to make it better, right? So this concept of the citizen nature of quality or creation, that's something that's going to continue to be bigger and bigger. And then the other, to Michael's question in the chat, if you went back 20 years and you described what Facebook or Twitter or some of these other companies are having to do to moderate content, and just said, hey, we're going to have, and you presented the problem statement. Hey, we're going to have billions of pieces of content that we got to review every day and say what stays and what goes, and we're going to get it wrong sometimes. 20 years ago, you would have gotten a compute error from whoever you were asking that to. Right? They'd be like, well, that's not, you can't do that, right? So how we're going to manage some of the requirements don't exist yet, right? And it's going to be, that's part of the creation that's going to happen to help support this around content. To your point, some of it's going to be laws, right? Disclosures that show you where it comes from. And some of it's going to be things that we just don't have yet on how we manage that complexity.
Yeah, I almost couldn't be more excited. And I feel like there's so much learning coming for all of us. There's so much change coming for all of us. that best thing we can do is keep educating ourselves, keep trying it out. I feel so fortunate that these tools are free and that you can actually just go and play with them. It's really truly transformative. Like for people on the call, if anybody hasn't played with ChatGPT, I think the fact that you made the effort to be on this call, I would say worth your time to go play with Midjourney, ChatGPT, just have some fun. There's so many prompts out there for different roles. You will be surprised at the immediate value that it can add. You'll be surprised. It can summarize a paper. It can rewrite it in a shorter form. Just things that you wish were easier. Some of them genuinely can be easier. So just try it out, and it'll give you a lot of opportunity where to think. So I don't know, Lauren, how much time do we have?
We're doing great. We've got about 20 minutes to go.
Oh, fantastic. So I wanted to dive a little bit more into let me just pick a question from here. So one of the big questions that's coming up is copyright and IP infringement. I think the fact that generative AI is consuming just any content and all content, like it's basically consuming the internet right now. And that was needed for the large language models to truly become what they are. But now for businesses to use this legitimately to make money or to change their customer interactions, the IP factor is real. So I don't know, Justin, if you have thoughts on this and if you guys are dealing with that.
Yeah, I think we should ask the chat bot. We should ask Chat GPT. I just asked it Michael's question and I got 10 better answers than what I gave y'all a second ago. So again, that's my default, is to try to use my brain, and the answer is no, I need to use the machine plus my brain. So that's a learning for me. About 10 years ago, I was helping a healthcare company innovate around personalized medicine and how to use genetics in personalized medicine. And even 10 years ago and even today, rules and regulations are still trying to catch up to how you're going to, protect genetic information. And I think that kind of comes back to all the comments you just made, is like part of the challenge is going to be how do we, governments move slow by design, but how do we get the right rules and regulation in place for copyright? Because again, if you go read, my wife would get nervous because she's an attorney and she hates when I start talking legal stuff, but like if you go read copyright laws and copyright rules and regulations, a lot of it's going to talk about kind of that threshold of, is it common knowledge versus is it proprietary knowledge? Well, with generative AI, everything's common knowledge. So what's the new standard of that we need to agree to, of what's where the copyright should sit? And I think that obviously that same sort of regulatory thing is in the self-driving car world as well. But like, how do we get, we need, right, the regulators and the rule makers to help us get those guardrails in place, I believe, Justin's opinion, so that we can then unlock the potential of how we go and do this in a way that complies. And again, that's where, when I look at, again, speaking of KPMG specifically, right, like that's where we have an advantage with a lot of our audit and tax type relationships we have in government when it comes to new rules and new regulations. And honestly, that's where we're spending a lot of time. When I'm not on calls with clients, I'm on calls internally or with, rule-making type entities to say, hey, how are we advising clients, given this is a gray area? And what needs to be done so that it's less gray?
Yeah, what I've been seeing is very similar, which is even in you gave the example of machine learning having been in marketing for decades, right? And what was so impactful about that machine learning is that for that one decision that you had to make, or for that one action that you had to take, it knew exactly what recommendation to make that's why next best action came from, right? That's exactly how it started. Or a recommended audience, or a recommended piece of content or a product. That it was very targeted. And that's where the power of this can also come back, which is if we took a very specific domain, like in this case, I'll say it's customer support, and I trained the AI model just on my product's documentation, all my support tickets, maybe all my product videos, everything that we have about product and nothing else. And we put some guardrails in that foundational model that you're not allowed to fabricate, or that if you can't find an answer, and if you do decide to go out to a larger open large language model, you just need to disclose that in the results. But now suddenly I've got a chatbot that's a customer support chatbot for my customers, trained on my information. And because it can talk in regular language, it's taken out all the friction of search. It's taken out all the friction of I don't know what I have to ask for. And then you can program it to implement whatever answer it gives you right there, right? I don't have to go to a support technician. I don't have to do anything, right? So this is where I think the next magical moment is coming from these highly targeted use cases where I can lock down what content it can use to generate its response.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, no, that one of the, I'm speaking of myself, like I hate when I get a chatbot and I know which questions to ask the chatbot or the IVR to get me to a real person. And as I was prepping for this call and this topic more broadly, I've tried to think like, okay, that's my human behavior. Why is that? And is that similar to folks that aren't in my, similar to me, whether it be demographics or age or whatever. And if I try to, if I say there's a concept called the 5 whys, like, okay, well, why does this happen? Well, why does that happen? Well, that, and you eventually get to kind of the recalls. And part of my aversion to chatbots historically has been the chatbot doesn't have the ability to fix it. So when I'm calling, I need something fixed. I don't always, by now, again, I'm savvy with internet stuff like the rest of the world. Like I've already found the information. I just don't like the answer and I need it to be fixed. I need an exception, or the information is based on a false assumption. So one, I do think the chatbots are going to get better. And so it's going to feel more like you're talking to a person. And there's partners that I work with that have already got that in their product set that, provide chatbots to servicing functions. That's part of it. The other part of this equally as important, in my opinion, from a customer experience lens, is does that machine, chatbot, whatever you want to call it, have the ability to go fix this situation? Yep. Right? Like, and again, I go back to, I sound very boring nowadays versus when I used to be in advertising, but like, it's about the rules, it's about the governance, it's about the company, enterprise risk frameworks and how we're going to work within that and stay true to our values. And, but that's really where, in my job, like that's where a lot of decisions have to be made now as we have this new capability.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you said that about the chatbot, because I have felt very similarly that I don't use Siri or Google Assistant or any of those just because I don't enjoy using them. It doesn't feel like it made it better for me. I'm just better clicking or using the app. However, for customer support, for my cable or my cell phone, I will always do the chat feature in their support. But I know I'm talking to a human on the other side, right? Now, with these chat conversational AI assistants, they're getting so good that you can use just your normal language with them, and they will have the ability to actually take action on the other side. So just the fact that, like yourself, I've been exploring a little bit more with ChatGPT. Whenever I have to create something, I will validate my answer. I will see if it has something else that I forgot. Maybe it has some labels or categories that I had not thought about. But I'm becoming more and more comfortable, and I'm becoming used to the idea that when it gives a response, you can come back with a follow-up prompt and modify that response and keep evolving it till you get to something that you feel is like the seed of what you were looking for. So it's something that I have wondered, how the people will respond, because I don't see my parents using a chatbot. Like I feel, but at the same time, they're on WhatsApp all day with me. So, it's a very interesting paradigm.
Well, and it's, you're similar to earlier when I answered the question using my head instead of first using the machine. So we have tendencies,
yes,
that were built before this capability existed. And so for us, we're going to be slower to adopt it than the people who are growing in that, are growing while that's a common kind of capability. I'll give you an example. If you haven't had this happen to you, well, at some point, my 6-year-old son fact checked me the other day. And by the way, he was right and I was wrong. And it was, everyone knows about the Titanic, right? That's been in the news. And he comes and he's like, "Hey, Dad, you know the Titanic's not the Titanic." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" Like, because we have all of his devices locked down. He's 6, but he does have an Alexa in his room. And he had read some book where it talked about, and I don't even know it, like y'all probably know better than me, but the conspiracy theory of like it was a different ship than it was actually the Titanic, and the other ship was sunk for the purpose of insurance. Again, I sound like I'm on a conspiracy theory. But he asked Siri, he's like, "Hey Siri, is the Titanic or is it this other ship?" And Siri gave him some coherent answer. And we were talking about it. He's like, "Dad, they weren't down there seeing the Titanic." And I'm like, "What do you?" And so anyways, his story though, I was like, "Hunter, you making that, like, you sound like you've been watching a conspiracy show. Like, what are you watching during the day while I'm on Zoom calls?" And anyways, it was but to your point, like, he's very natural at using Alexa, using Siri. My daughter my 8-year-old daughter sends better text messages to me with the usage of emojis than I do. But that's because that's what she's grown up with, right? And so the same thing's going to happen around generative AI. Like the people who are now coming out of college, and it's going to be, in the next year or two, and it's going to be part of their day-to-day job. They're going to be much better at using it and getting value out of it than people who didn't, unless we learn and adapt and challenge our pre-existing thoughts. So that's sort of some stuff that kind of comes to mind as you were talking.
Yeah, my wife and I talk about this all the time. We were talking to somebody on the phone the other day, and it was my wife's brother, and we gave the phone to my daughter. She's 9. And she literally didn't know how to talk on a phone call. She's like trying to put the phone this way and looking for his face, and she's so confused. And we realized, like, she never talks on the phone. She only does FaceTime, right? So it was just like a bizarre moment that she doesn't even understand what a phone call is anymore. And if I go to her iPad and I ask her where the settings app is, she doesn't even realize that I'm looking for the icon. She just goes to Siri and she's like, "Open settings." So I totally agree with you that a big part of this is our reaction to the change in paradigm of what we are used to. But as soon as the paradigm switches, we all adapt. Like, can you imagine a life without a mobile phone? And we all grew up without mobile phones, right? So we embraced it as fast as it was available. So in this context of what these generative models are unlocking, right? There's generative content, of course, but generative content has 2 sides to it. I ask you to create content, or I ask you to help me understand content. And those are 2 both very powerful opportunities. And then you move on to generative software, where I change how you interact with my software, and I change how I build my own software. Both those opportunities are coming. And then you'll take all that and you'll combine it to personalization. And now, like, with a chatbot, this is something I was discussing with somebody that blew my mind, right? If you think about personalization till today, we have always, what we have called personalization has been the marketer's best guess on what the customer actually wants. Customer has never actually told us what they wanted. We were like, well, if you live here and if you have these habits and if you did these actions and you clicked on this product in the past, this is what you want, right? This is why YouTube thinks when I watch one song of a particular dance, that's all I want to watch for the rest of my life. And it drives everybody crazy. But now with this system, it's a pull system. Now a consumer or a shopper can ask for exactly what they want and get it. So now I think personalization becomes the true one-to-one. If we want to go there, maybe you could go there. Have you guys thought about that?
Yeah, I think we've definitely thought about that. And I think it goes back to what I said earlier, in the sense of, like, we've always wanted to personalize. We're just getting better and more mature at it because of things that have helped us unlock that potential, right? And I think of, some of the best marketers, some of the most innovative personalization marketers today are people who grew up in direct mail, because they had to think about it all. Now, the time that they're using is different. Like they had to use a lot of time to curate data, cleanse data, analyze data, and then get the offer and then test the offer, right? Now they have tools like Teal, right, that give them the data faster. They have the cloud that it crunches it faster. They now have AI models, broadly speaking, that can predict better. And so anyways, that's to your point, like around the generative AI piece of it, we as an industry are going to need some things to happen so that we can get more out of it. I don't know the exact number, but I've heard that generative AI queries take 7 times more compute power than traditional AI queries, right? Well, that has an impact. That has an ESG impact. That has a compute power impact, all that stuff. So those are things we have to solve as a collective, right, through new technology to go get more out of the capability.
Yeah, it's so true. One of the things we always say is like personalization in many ways is like parenting. It's just always hard. But the reason it's hard keeps changing as your child grows. Similarly, as technology evolves, where you're spending your time in personalization keeps moving, the goalpost keeps moving, but it's still hard, right? You mentioned something just now that I wanted to bring up, which is security and protection of your models. One of the things people are really concerned about is just attack to your model and changing the source. I don't know if you guys, I'm sure KPMG has been in part of that discussion.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier. We were one of the first professional services firms to bring it into our 4 walls and start using it for our work. And I should have said the other way around. We were one of the first ones to start using it for our work. The way we were able to do that is we brought it into our 4 walls, right? Like we couldn't have our associates, whether they're in audit, tax, or consult advisory, just out there using the open AI models, because there's tons of risks with that. Like you go ask it a question about a potential merger, and now that's common in somebody's database about so there's a lot of reasons you can't do that. And so from a security standpoint, right, you've got to bring it in, you've got to control the access, you've got to we have to start investing in the additional jobs of people that go make sure it's using data we want it to use, that it doesn't have biases, again, all the things we've talked about in this call. So but the number one thing on security was we had to bring it into our controlled environments, and it couldn't be out there just open in the day-to-day course of business. And obviously we partner with Microsoft to do that, but there's others out there as well. So that's how we're doing it. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's and we're learning. Again, we're retraining our associates on how to do tasks they've always done now with this superpower capability, and we're getting better every day at it.
Yeah, it's a great point. Like the way we think about it is similar, which is we are already protecting our customer data. We are already protecting all our sensitive information, our health and financial information. This is not anything different. It's a data set, and you got to apply all the same security to the data set like you would to any of your other data. And the reality is that as these models get trained, we will understand better where they get the bias from, how that works. Right now, the transparency of the models is a question that people are trying to work on. The fact that whether you have access to content does not mean you're allowed to use that content. So another thing that EU is trying to put out there is people are allowed to opt out. That yes, this is my piece of content, my song, my video, whatever, and I don't want it used in generative AI models. And models have to then leave out that content when they're using training data. So that's another thing that EU is pushing. I think that'll make a big difference. So in many ways, I've been looking at the regulations that are coming again, being discussed against this, very similar to data privacy, right? The rights belong to the content creator, the rights belong to the content generator, and the model sits in the middle. And the model is a piece of technology that has to follow certain rules. And first we had to unlock the value, which we've done. We had to prove that we want this technology, which we've done. And we want to prove that it helps, which we've done. Now we got to enforce rules so that it doesn't run away, right? Which is what I think is going to be the next year. Already we can see the way this year has started. It's moving from the top layer of the generative AI to the back end. It's making the foundational models more accessible this year. Data warehouses are getting involved in a really big way. And I think all of us, we're going to have so many opportunities to experiment with this and affect our business, whatever it is, that I think just excitement level is at peak. And I think it's just going to keep going up. So,
and I think, if I were to have a parting thought, because I know we're close to time, you made a good comment, and it's, you know, if I kind of take a comment you made and a comment I made, like, if you aren't doing it, get out there and play with Chat GPT and talk to it like it's a human and see what you get. Right. And I know for me, again, one of the examples when it really unlocked my mind towards it was we were, as a family, we had gone to Cabo a couple times over the last few years because it's convenient from Dallas. It's our kids love it. You can't get in the ocean, so as a parent, that's nice.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, you can. It's just very, very may not be safe. And so I went to ChatGPT and I said, hey, I'm going to Cabo with 4 kids and, you know, that like to do this. Like, what do you recommend? And 90% of what it recommended is stuff that we did, but we did it after my wife and myself did a ton of research to curate that experience, right? So again, it's not, it just, you know, I imagine the hours we spent planning the trip, if we'd spent it on something else because it planned 90% of it. So that's when it started to really change my frame of, okay, how can we use it in business? Where can it add value? And then again, how can it make the human aspect of the job even more valuable? Right.
Yeah, I love that example. Okay, so we have a couple of minutes left. So I wanted to end with some examples that I found that I feel are really worth checking out for anybody who's really interested. I already talked about the example of the biblical verse of taking out a PB&J from VCR. I strongly suggest you just look for it. It's very entertaining. I've been enjoying Bohemian Rhapsody sung by the Beatles. That was a really well done video. Those on the entertainment side. On the business side, there's an AI called Rose AI. It takes a giant spreadsheet and gives you a NLP version summary so you can understand the data, which is mind-blowing for my days in business school and working on Excel sheets. There's a SQL.io, which turns live B2B content into summaries, posts, blogs, articles, and then you can do stuff with it. I definitely recommend watching the ChatGPT video about their AI, their chatbot, just to see where software can go in MarTech with AI as the interaction model. So these are some of my recommendations. And the stat that is blowing my mind that I wanted to say is by 2025, 90% of all material in quarterly reports will be synthetically generated, which is crazy because I know by 2023, 90% of quarterly report analysis is going to be done by ChatGPT. So, you know, more and more people are going to use ChatGPT to summarize the report and not really read it. And it's funny that the source of the report is going to be ChatGPT as well in a couple of years. So that's kind of the world we're heading in, the vicious loop of bots talking to each other, I think. I don't know, Justin, do you have anything you want to end with? And then we hand back to Lauren.
No, I think those are all great examples. And then I would encourage you, if you haven't, go ask ChatGPT what the best examples are. And it'll give you different ones in 2 days than it'll give you today.
I didn't think of doing that. That's a great idea.
Love that. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Justin, thanks so much for joining us from KPMG. Really appreciate your partnership. Sav, thank you for sharing your wisdom on, you know, early days of generative AI. I'm with you, super enthusiastic about where this can go in the future and what it's going to do to business. We are going to be posting some follow-up blogs on tealium.com/blogs that will summarize a lot of the great information that was covered today. So we'll be sure to follow up with all of you and send you those blogs so you can check those out and share with your colleagues. Stay connected with us. If you have more conversations or questions that you want to have another conversation about, you could always email us at community@tealium.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for sharing your hour with us today. Go out and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Great presentation.
Thanks.